Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this online seminar of the Illiberalism Studies Program at the George Washington University. Delighted to have you with us today and to receive our guest, Günter Frankenberg, who is presenting here his books that have been released a few months ago, Authoritarianism, Constitutional Perspectives. Professor Frankenberg is a professor of public law, legal philosophy, and comparative law at Goethe University at Frankfurt at Main. We're discussing today, presenting him here the main thesis of the book, and I think it's really a key element of the general discussion we have about the nature of political regimes. So looking today at why autocrats have constitutions. And that's, of course, a key issue that I think has been part of the global discussion about the rise of a kind of illiberal constitutionalism. So we see a lot of this kind of vocabulary emerging now, trying to understand why leaders who are not classic democrats needs the constitution and why that's just more than a facade, but something that is also meaningful for autocracy to have a constitution. And I think Günter will be able to help us kind of disentangle that question. And I will give him the floor now, and then we will have time for a Q&A session. So Günter, welcome. Thanks again for being with us, and the floor is yours.
I have to thank you for inviting me. This is an honor and a joy under I would say almost post-COVID circumstances. We are still limited. So I really was looking forward to this. And what I want to do is I present you some of the ideas of the book. I try to invent more ideas, but that's always difficult. And of course, I try to relate it to Putin, Russia, and the Ukraine war. And I just couldn't do that. I think we can do that maybe in the discussion. So we stay with the constitutional question. And I show you, and now I try to split the screen and then show you a few pictures as we go along, okay? So why do autocrats bother making or revising a constitution? I think I got to this question because I felt that my liberal colleagues had nothing really interesting and convincing to say about this topic. And so I thought maybe one could look for a more interesting answer. And if we look at autocratic or authoritarian constitutions, we could look at the Soviet Union in 1924, at Stalin in 1936, Hitler's Enabling Act in 1933, and the question in that, I think I started there, because I asked myself, he was a mass murderer. Why would he seriously extend the Enabling Act? Because he had enabled himself to do lots of killings and wars, etc., etc. Then we have Pinochet's referendum in 1988, Chavez referendum in 1998, Assad, the constitutional revision in the middle of the civil war in 2011 and 12, Erdogan, constitutional revision in 2017, Xi Jinping in 2018, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to do something else than saying this is just a facade. But before we do so, let's just look at the gallery of shame so that we know who are the people we are dealing with. And of course, it seems obvious that this person here is Adolf Hitler. Most of the other persons you know, and we will not, I don't think I have to present them to you. Let's just go ahead with our questions. So why is it window dressing? That would be the liberal answer. Or is it really a puzzle that we should solve? My first take was, I think it is a puzzle, because it really puzzled me that Hitler did this. It puzzled me that Stalin took his time. I mean, he was in the middle of killing people, but he sat down with his committee and debated a new constitution in 1936, et cetera, et cetera. And then also Assad in the middle of the civil war. So, and I thought maybe a good approach would be to consider constitutions as texts with special purposes, written for a specific audience, and of course, in a specific historical political context. So my I thought it would be an interesting project to look for purposes and then audiences. And we will come back to this at the very end. Before I could get there, I thought it would be important to really, for a moment at least, to think what would be an authoritarian regime. What are the characteristics? And here is, and I distinguish two types of purposes, symbolic purposes and instrumental purposes. If we will come back to we could say they treat the Constitution as a decor, or they use it as a ritual, a decorum, or they use it for propaganda purposes. And in a more instrumental sense, I mean, like using constitutions as a tool, one could say, and they obviously sort of relate to the problems of order and discipline, especially disciplining rivaling elites. Even in an authoritarian regime, you have several groups who are interested in power. And then, of course, you have the international identity thing. And what we all know is that authoritarianism has to do with governing. It describes a certain technique of governing, and then we come back to the communication. So I want to show you a few of the symbolic purposes, which I really think are impressive. This is the Constitution Day in Kyrgyzstan. And if a constitution is not considered important, well, here you have a picture. So what I will do now in the next, I don't know, 10 minutes, 12 minutes or so, I will describe the four crucial elements of authoritarian regimes, and then I will turn and say, how do they relate to the constitutional questions? And the four constitutional elements are structures of governance. That seems the easy part. Second, modes of participation. That's a more difficult discussion. Third, the concept and practice of power. And finally, the style of communication that we find in constitutional regimes. So let's start with the structures of governance. I mean, we all know they privilege the executive, and we could know that they somehow combine a Machiavellian and Hobbesian technique of governing, especially ruling by decree, making elaborate use of the prerogative, much more than John Locke had in mind when he wrote the Treatises of Government. Moreover, and this is less obvious, it seems to me important to note that the structure of governance is informal, I mean, rather than formal, because autocrats don't like to be bound by procedures. They prefer secrecy. And all in all, one could say that they have a rather opportunistic relationship to the Constitution. That was the first element. The second is power as private property, not trust, not tenure. So then we have three aspects that would make it look sort of specific. First, we have a special concept of power. You could say in the tradition of the French roi soleil, l'état c'est moi. Whatever, if we twist this a little bit, it's not just I am the king or I'm the state, but l'état c'est à moi. That means I own the state. Marlene could give us a long sort of explanation about this, I'm sure. Let me just sort of catch up with where I'm now. This is another symbolism, Hugo Chavez with his constitution. I think it's wonderful. It's sort of tiny but impressive. Of course, he imitates it. And this is maybe for later, if we have the time, I would like to ask you. Marlene should know. She has a French background. So, of course, there's the Constitution. My question is, this big book, what's that?
What?
When I asked my students, and of course it's very hard. They barely know this guy. This is, of course, Charles de Gaulle. He is a general and was a war hero, and his role in Algeria was not so heroic. But this is an interesting book, and I can't. Do you have an idea, Marlene? By coincidence?
No, I don't know.
it's the history of the French military. I think it's wonderful because it's bigger than the Constitution. And if you look at his hand, it really is, he's very relaxed about the Constitution. I mean, Lukashenko tries to be really impress the Constitution with his presence and many others. So second, so first, structures of governance. Second aspect, power as private property. When I wrote the book, I must say that was the chapter that I loved writing, because I had the idea that this could be specific, but then I thought, no, this is really terrific. I mean, if you look at how sort of autocrats deal with power, how they feel, how they assume ownership, and I don't want to give you all the details. And I mean, the three aspects are the concept, like autocratic centralism, then the right to determine the successor. And it occurred to me when I was looking around that very often the successor is not from the family, which would be dynastic principle, but very often medical doctors seem to have the trust of the autocrat, the dictator, and they followed. And then we have the last one is the right to everything, but not in the Hobbesian sense, but more in the kleptocratic sense, that many autocrats are really sort of put aside an enormous amount of wealth. Putin is estimated to own between 38 to 200 billion US dollars. A conservative estimate is really would be 38. That would be a lot for a guy who used to be in the Secret Service. Then we have, of course, Ceausescu, Kim Jong-un, Jose dos Santos. He's less known, but he also owns 20 billion, etc., etc. So you have to look this up, because it's either in the book or also in the internet. The third aspect is modes of participation, instrumental and symbolic. If necessary, autocrats submit to the rules of elective democracy, like Hungary, Turkey, Mexico, Trumpism, plus, of course, manipulation. If possible, because of the political constellation, they use participation as complicity. Maybe we can discuss about this later. In the beginning, I thought, no, you can't really say that autocrats love participation, but I have been convinced by a friend to look into that, and I really thought it's really more complicated. One could say that they love participation to create, and that was my answer, complicity, to create silent partners of the regime who have nothing to say, but who have, like in Mussolini, fascism, National Socialism, Peronism, Putinism, Bonapartism, etc., they would, what they are, of course, they remain silent partners even if they acclaim the leaders. They have no voice in the democratic theory sense, but they get attunement and a desublimated ecstasy. This is my Frankfurt School background. And membership in an imaginary community. I come back to that in a second. And what the people have to deliver is public presence. They have to show up in the public sphere and gives conspicuous support for the regime. And the last chapter, which is probably my second favorite, maybe it's also my favorite, is the style of communication geared towards, I have to really catch up, I forget doing this. This is the problem. This is the Machiavellian Hobbesian style, of course. These are the quasi-private property dynasties. And here you have Haiti, Papa Doc and his terrible baby doc. And this is what I just talked about. Maybe this gives you a better idea that why I think all these people, here the Germans, and here is, I think we are in, I think it's, could be North Korea. This is, I forgot where I got this picture. It could also, yeah, I think it's North Korea. The idea is that they show up in the public sphere in a big rally and they sort of acclaim their leaders. So in a way, they cannot later, they cannot say, I didn't support the system. So in that sense, they are not accomplices in the criminal sense, but more in what I think in a political sense. Hoppala. But the misfiring, we have to, when participation misfires, we have to skip, because otherwise I promised I would do it in 30 minutes, right? But we can, I just recommend that you see the movie No, which sort of deals with the referendum Pinochet initiated in 1988 because he wanted to extend his tenure. Of course, he lost to everyone's surprise. This is, of course, the wonderful women heroes from Belarus. And this is 1789, when the king, he just wanted the general estates to support him, to levy taxes, and in the end, you know what happened, the revolution, and the Third Estate said, we are the National Assembly. So the cult of immediacy and the fantasies of community was also something I really enjoyed doing. And immediacy means that it works in two directions. On the state side, it means that autocrats like to get rid of or grind down parliaments, the judiciary, oppositional party, and on the side of the society, they try to get rid of all the intermediate controlling organizations like the unions, the media, and of course today it's also the internet. They try to get rid of or at least control. This is interesting because this is from Germany from the 1933 following years. It says the whole of Germany listens to the Führer, and this is what we call in Germany a Volksempfänger. It's sort of the people's receiver, which is really interesting because the people are not supposed to discuss, to say something other than, of course, say hooray, but they have to listen what the Führer has to say. And it reminded me of a beautiful passage from Hobbes' Leviathan, where he said that the lips of the people are tied to the ears of the people are tied to the lips of the leader. So this is what I mean. Unmediated communication goes in two directions. This is sort of the state direction, is no intermediate institutions, no parliaments, no courts, or weak. Look at Poland, what happened. Look at Hungary, what happened. You don't even have to look at the what we call totalitarian regimes. Also, the non-totalitarian regimes like Poland or things, they really got rid of. I would say the courts didn't play much of a role in Hungary, and it started when Orban was still a liberal. It started with a very strong constitutional court, because I once met the president of the Constitutional Court. He studied in Frankfurt for a while, and he sort of one of my senior mentors. He really liked them a lot, and he wanted the Hungarian Constitutional Court to be as strong as the German. And one could say that Orban, in the course of his regime, really got rid of this Constitutional Court, and today it's really almost next to irrelevant. Sorry. This is the society side is no intermediary organizations, no parties, unions, uniform media or controlled media, Russia. I mean, I could in many cases say Russia. So what's the purpose of all this? I mean, what is the purpose of this mode of participation as creating complicity? What is the purpose of this type of communication that sort of installs a cult of immediacy? That's sort of, I thought this is maybe something new that I wanted to sort of present to you. It sort of, in two directions, it has a transformative power. The first is they transform power into authority, and the second is they transform the followers or accomplices, in my vocabulary, into a community, both with a strong imaginary aspect. And the power authority relationship I take from a Norwegian philosopher, Steinringen, and I just read you a quote. What rulers need in order to get others to do something is not so much power as authority. A governor has authority when others obey his wishes, not only because they must, but because they want to. I mean, this is crucial, that you somehow get them sort of to want to support you. And he says that dictatorial governments must lean on power. Democratic governments, they have to have something else. And I would say also autocracies cannot just lean on power, because leaning on power gets sort of expensive in the long run. And there's a beautiful quote from Marx in Capital, first volume: "One man is king only because other men stand in the relation of subjects to him. They, on the contrary, imagine that they are subjects because he is king." So you see the reciprocity. And of course, we can say that once power sort of is installed, the reciprocity gets lost to a certain extent, because people have to obey. And of course, the regime members, they can order, but still they can say, we wanted this. And I guess this wanting is a crucial aspect. And the second transformation of followers and accomplices who are ruled into a community, we call it technically in constitutional, the people, is also, and even more so, a matter of imagination that is fueled by the phantasm of, in France, Grande Nation, in Arab countries, in Muslim countries by the Ummah, in many other countries by variations of the people. So what does the Constitution do? The Constitution delivers the matrix for what Adorno, one of my philosophical heroes, once called the unity gimmick. It is usually introduced in, I would say, most constitutions of the world, and I call this the frequent flyer formula: we the people, plus a unity narrative that you find in preambles, plus a constitutional ideology that the autocrat provides. For instance, in the most prominently in China, it's and also in the Chinese constitutions, it's Xi Jinping's thoughts. Second, the leader of the regime propagates the type of community to create this fantasy. It can be tribal. I mean, Trump clearly, I would say, propagated, even if he didn't use these very words, we the white Americans. I mean, I think he had to rely, I think 70% of his voters found it important that they were white. In Germany, it's a combination not this tribalism and it's faith and ethnicity in the I would say in the old days, we the German Volksgemeinschaft. In Poland, it's the combination of Catholicism and nationalism, we the community of Catholic Poles. And in Hungary, there's an interesting combination of history, a very specific concept of history, which goes back to the Middle Ages and has been included in the constitution, and ethnicity. And all this is supported by what I would call the body politics of the leader, who presents, it's always men, presents himself as your neighbor. I mean, not like Stalin with his favorite daughter, Svetlana. And here you have we the people, sort of the community of faith in Germany. This is the religious community in Iran. This is the Polish patriotic community. This is the American community. And this is the new German right-wing group, Alternative for Germany. They want to reinvigorate the concept of ethnicity and, you could say, let's say, Germanness. And now comes the self-presentation of the autocrat. Hitler, like lying in the grass with his favorite shepherd, who ironically is called Blondie. And then you have Putin. He wants to scare. He knew that Angela Merkel was scared of dogs, and he has this dog. And I'm sure he said to her, what we all have heard, oh, he's just harmless. This is a nice guy. And she, look at her face. She doesn't really like this idea. It's very often that autocrats present themselves with dogs or horses. we have to think about that. And of course, they'd like to show that they are physically totally fit. For instance, this is Mao Zedong, and here are some swimmers. This is the Yellow River. They follow him, make sure that he doesn't drown. And here, this is the famous, what I would call autocratic, not popular, what is it? Pornography. And here Hitler again with a shepherd, and here Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, horse and dog. I mean, it's sort of this combination of skin showing, being together with animals, children. Hitler couldn't show his skin because he was completely, his body wasn't something that you wanted to present in the public sphere. So, and this is, actually we could stop here. This is my matrix, but it's also in the book. What do you think, Marlene?
I think you can present the matrix, yes.
I mean, I love matrices. I have a matrix complex. And because I wanted to distinguish the audiences, I mean, the internal or domestic and the external audience. And I wanted to distinguish basic purposes of constitutions, more leaning to the instrumental, and basic purposes leaning to the symbolic. And that gives you like 4 quadrants. And the first, you could say here, the Constitution functions as a quadrant, enforcing order, disciplining competing elites, containing the opposition, giving windfalls for loyal cadres. And if we still direct it at the domestic, and we could also say the symbolic side of this, also directed to the domestic, is the program that you offer them in, like, promise security, unity, you mobilize for common values. It could be social peace or socialism or nationalism. It doesn't make any difference. Anything works because the constitutions are generous. And of course, which is more crucial, constitutions also have to manage disappointment. When you disappoint people, what we right now witness, and I just read this in a so-called mega study, they found out that in many autocratic regimes, the people are disappointed because the regime cannot deliver what they promised. For instance, in Hungary, that's why it could be that Orban loses the next election. They promised security in the context of Corona, and of course they couldn't deliver. So that it's really interesting that the constitution may help, but this is probably the most difficult part. Then if we go to the external audience, we could say, in general, I would say people outside of one country are not interested in the constitution at all, unless there's some special sort of reason to do so. But it's important that the constitution functions as an identity card in the international community, that a country can seek legal recognition and say, look, we are an ordered state, we have a constitution, look, we're a sovereign nation, etc. And as an aside, this is what I learned in Vietnam. You can also, by sort of raising the identity card, you can also say, we want to attract investment. It worked in Vietnam in 1992 because investment would be protected, and so people were ready to invest, and also at the same time they had the chance to settle conflicts outside of the Vietnamese court system. And then we come to the last part, and I would say there is what liberals call socialist and Arab constitutions. There we have them as a showcase. But it's also interesting that some offer alliance and membership. They show order, which we shouldn't trust always. And also the demonstration of statehood should always be questioned. And they appease people sort of so that they might come to the country. And this is again the economic aspect, and take it and sort of are willing to invest in the countries. So that's completely, of course, it's completely, how can I say that? It's a heuristic device, which needs much more work. And as all of these sort of matrices, it doesn't capture the complicity. And what I want to say, and this is just one moment, it could be that one constitution is sort of qualifies for as a strong manual, and it could also qualify as a showcase at the same time. So I'm not saying every constitution just goes into one bracket. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Günter, for that great presentation and kind of summary of the main thesis of the book. I think it's really give us a great overview of these different aspects. And it's putting, in fact, a lot of elements that we have in the literature, I think in political philosophy of political science, putting them together. And I'm was myself particularly interested by both the disciplining aspect and the reciprocity aspect. And I think in the case of Russia, I was thinking about the 2020 constitutional amendments that are really kind of fitting really perfectly your frame on both of the four sides, but really on the internal demand side. So I would like to open the floor for a discussion. Now I have some questions, but I would like to give the floor to our audience. You can ask. Yeah, I see Julian. If you can introduce yourself also for our guest. Yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Frankenberg. That was really fascinating, very interesting. I had a question at the very, very end of your presentation, looking at that matrix. You added on the side, that very last slide, these pointing out where these certain constitutions had all elements of this matrix, whereas post-revolutionary states only had certain. And I found that very interesting. I was wondering how much you delved into that in your book from a comparative perspective, sort of breaking down authoritarian constitutions by the degree to which and the ways in which they have these sub-elements. What struck me, because you went through the slide kind of quickly, but what struck me was this post-revolutionary constitutions tend to have programmatics in a way that other constitutions don't necessarily do. And is that just because of ideology, or is that because of the particular nature of the post-revolutionary moment, the seizure of power, the maintenance of power, and trying to maintain legitimacy along a certain trajectory, fundamentally different from, say, a regime that's born out of a coup, or a regime that is undergoing democratic backsliding, right, and sort of autocratizes over time. And you have a very different means of capturing power, of then saying that, oh, the regime is legitimate because of X or because of Y, or this is the reason why the junta keeps running the show, and now they're no longer called the junta. Here's what's going on. Here's why you should still support us. I was just wondering if the book has more on that, let's say, divide among these different sub-elements within the matrix, and what you think that may or may not say about how we might be able to distinguish regime origins, regime type, things of that nature. That was a lot. Sorry.
So, do you want me to wait, Marlene, or
no? I think you can take that. That's already a lot to unpack for a discussion, and then we can give the floor.
So, Julian, that is, of course, in Germany we would say the Gretchen question. No, the answer would be no. I have not made any systematic research because I was so exhausted when I was done with the book, and I had done some, how could you say that, some case studies, and I would, for instance, find it absolutely necessary to do more research in the Arab region. That's one thing that but what I wanted to do is I wanted to show with sort of to illustrate how certain constitutions somehow fit into different quadrants. And another thing that I think is crucial, and maybe is also missing in the book, I wrote at 2 points that not all regimes qualify as authoritarian if they have all the 4 elements. I think now it would be crucial to look at which elements have to be in place so that we can comfortably say that's authoritarian. I would sort of, my intuition tells me two elements would be, for instance, the technique of governing has to be there always, and but not necessarily the concept of power as property doesn't. I think that doesn't have to be there. But then, of course, you need some kind of authoritarian system of participation. So, but it's that I haven't really finished that. So that, like in many books, at the end you feel you have written 300 pages and there is a lot, there are many open questions, but why not? Why don't you do this? Why don't you make a systematic study of what you just asked? No, I'm serious. I'm not facetious. I'm really serious. It's a wonderful question. And actually it's more than that. It's a project, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't deliver. I could only, at the end of the book, I felt I was convinced that this matrix works to a certain degree, like all matrices, right? Now the more systematic analysis would have to follow by a more, I would say by a bigger project that would be open, of course, to revise the matrix, of course. Does it make sense?
Yes, thank you very much for the answer. That made a lot of sense. Much appreciated.
Very good. I see Nathan Brown, and then we will have a question after from Raphael. Nathan first.
Okay, thank you very much. And my question sort of builds on Julian's and your answer to that. I'm not surprised you're exhausted after completing the book because you've got such a great global focus. And I don't have a global focus. I've got a myopic focus on the Arab world, really, which is the area where you said you wished you could spend more time. So, with my myopic view, when I look at that, in a sense, when I look at your matrix and your description of how autocratic constitutions operate, and I look with my very kind of finely grained view, I just see an awful lot of variation. For instance, in you say need for participation. Some actually do attempt to mobilize them in parties, and some try very, very hard to demobilize the society. I mean, that's variation. So I'm not going to try and exhaust you even more and get you to explain everything, including the Arab world. But my question is just, what sort of variations would you look to? I mean, you suggested it very, very briefly in your answer to Julian. Governance techniques, but I'm just wondering what kind of variation begins to appear to you, and how do you explain these kinds of variations? What sort of factors would you look at? Julian was asking about regime origin. So again, I'm not trying to exhaust you or get you to say something definitive, but I'm just interested in your speculation as somebody who's done so much comparative work. What sort of things would attract your attention and be interested or where you'd suggest the rest of us start looking?
So first of all, Nathan, I have to say that I'm thrilled that I finally get to look at you. This is wonderful. Of course, I know you from the literature, from your work, and I always thought, this person is doing what I will be not doing sufficiently in my book. But what I thought, but that's not, now to your question, because I find the Arab world completely fascinating. And I remember when the so-called Arab Spring started, I wrote an essay and I was excited that I had found something. And I wanted to, of course, dismiss the idea that the Arab world, they can't do democracy. And I said, look, they can do anti-despotism, but well, let's not go into that. I mean, it's a bit disappointed than what happened later. No, what I thought is that if we, for instance, if I feel that in my four features or characteristics, I have to unpack them more. For instance, if we look at the autocratic techniques of governing, and I said, well, it's a combination of Machiavellism and Hobbesianism, and that's already needs more explanation that I'm giving in the book. For instance, it would be important to say so. at what point would, for instance, the extensive use of the state of exception would black out all the other aspects? Or could we say that a regime could be sort of leaning, like Egypt, for instance, leaning to the state of exception and rule by decree, and still would qualify for a comparison with other, let's say, Hungary, which is not as extreme? So that, I see, well, that would be my first tack if I go back to this, which is always tricky when you have a book. I think you should just let it be there and have people criticize it. I think unpacking each of these 4 packages would be my first task. And I feel that I was a little bit generous regarding the technique of governing, because I felt when we talk autocracy, we all agree that there is a centralization of power. And then, so we all agree it's sort of leaning to the executive. And so I guess I was a little bit, I don't want to say sloppy, but I thought, everybody will accept this. Whereas I was sure that trying to sell the idea of power as private property needs more work. And I thought I presented more work. Or the cult of immediacy. I had read very little about this, just 1 page on, for instance, by a very smart political scientist. He wrote 1 page or 2 pages on Trump, describing his style as cult of immediacy. So I feel I did more work there, and I neglected and also I had really trouble to get through with participation. And because in the beginning I felt, no, participation in authoritarian regimes is always orchestrated. So the authoritarian leaders, whether they are really evil despots or whether they are mild despots, like, let's say, the guys in Poland or Hungary, they don't need participation. And a very good friend of mine convinced me, I was lucky to have him as a convincer, that no, you can't do this. They really need participation. And so that was those were the 2 opposing views: no participation necessary, or no, absolutely necessary. And my way out was participation as complicity. And I'm not sure I have done a good job there. I feel I'm more, how can I say this in English? I alluded to what is important, but I think I should really work that out more stringently, more systematically, because I really feel now that this is a good idea, but in the book, I just didn't, at the end of the participation chapter, I think I should have given more evidence of what does it mean by looking at special forms of participation, especially the referendum, which in Germany used to be, and I must confess, I was also sort of the element of direct democracy. So it was the epitome of democracy. And I think we should really discuss that very, very thoroughly, whether referenda can be taken out of the Bonapartist tradition. I think that I should have done more. So I would say those are the 2. I feel I'm comfortable with power as property, and I'm comfortable with communication and cult of immediacy, but I'm not really comfortable with the first, because I thought, everyone takes it for granted. It's the style of governing, and I think it has to be sort of because Hobbes is not Machiavelli. I think I really like Hobbes. I find him really interesting as a political thinker, and Machiavelli I have great problems with. And I should have sort of, I would say, unpacked this, and I should have unpacked I would say the participation concept much more, but I guess I didn't know more at the time. That's the problem. If you write books, you know that. Sometimes one doesn't have a better interpretation.
Can
So
I?
thank you for the question.
can I abuse the fact that I can unmute myself and just a quick comment.
Sure.
As you were talking, one thing I just noticed is when you talk about autocrats, you do talk about some that we would all agree, right? I mean, Hitler's there. You also mentioned people like Trump, and there's a picture of de Gaulle there, and those are people who are operating. They may have autocratic tendencies, but in democratic systems. And I think one of the things that you might give us is not necessarily a classification of existing states, but of directions, right? Here are autocratizing tendencies, and you give us a wonderful way to look at those. So no, Trump is not Hitler, but there are certain ways in which he is moving the American system in an autocratic direction, which we can understand from your framework. I should be a better participant and end that with a question mark, but it's just an observation that occurred to me as you were speaking.
No, it has a question mark, Nathan, because I really think what I did in the book is I distinguished authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I felt I could do that distinction. But then I was really viciously criticized by a guy from Romania for whatever reason, because he could have been nicer to me, but don't we say that always when we get a bad review? He said, you cannot compare Hitler and Trump. And I said, I'm a comparatist, and I don't compare them, both of them, across the board. But it's interesting, for instance, that Hitler, who ran his campaign on the slogan, the will of the people comes before the will of the individual. The moment he was appointed the Reichschancellor, he spoke to the tax office in Munich to make sure that he didn't have to pay his taxes for his struggle. And he had an enormous tax debt, like 400,000 Reichsmark was a lot of money at the time. And at the end of his regime, he never paid a single German Reichsmark for the book, because he finally was exempt from taxes by having negotiated this deal with the head of the Munich tax office. And if you look at Trump's way of handling taxes, I think it is fair to say it's not the same, but interesting that he also feels that he doesn't have to sort of disclose his taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I'm saying. What you're asking me to do is, and that would really be a new book, and that would be something maybe I would like to do, is to write a phenomenology of authoritarian leaders or regimes. It's a fabulously interesting but also difficult book to write. Then I cannot just get away with saying these are totalitarians and these are authoritarians.
That's great remarks, I think. Thank you so much, Nathan and Günter. We have a question from Raphael also.
Yes, I hope you hear me. Yes.
Yes.
So first, thanks for your presentation. And
Raphael, it's hard for me to understand.
Okay, I will try to speak louder, maybe.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah. Okay, I will speak louder. So maybe I can reformulate my question a bit. Do you think authoritarian constitutionalism is a blind spot for legal thought? And following the remark of Nathan, do you think the distinction between authoritarian constitutionalism and neoliberal constitutionalism is a difference of nature or of degree? When we compare the constitutionalism of the Thatcher and Reagan governance and the use of constitution by autocrats, or the use of constitutions by current illiberal leaders in Hungary or Poland, do you think that this comparison is interesting, or do you have any insights? So I will stop there.
Okay, so I have a very good friend who sort of when I wrote my first article on, which then became the book, I wrote on authoritarian constitutionalism. and related it to the problem of modernity by saying that this also is a child of the modern project. And I felt that in order to argue that, I had to say, let's look at liberalism or liberal constitutionalism and see whether we have something authoritarian, which is sort of like, I can say that now, the dirty secret. And I started with John Locke, and because I felt that in the two treatises, he has a very long chapter on the prerogative. And so my argument was that liberalism has always already inserted into the liberal scheme of governing the prerogative, which is, of course, sort of privileging the executive. And so, and I carried this through from the prerogative to state of exception and, let's say, militant democracy and many other institutions that we have in the liberal rule of law scheme. And at the end, I talked about discretion, norms that give the administration discretion. And since I have done a lot of work as a lawyer, I always found the moment where you hit a norm that gives the administration discretion, it's like running against the wall. And even if people tell me, yeah, but they need discretion, it preserves their flexibility, and the sort of discretion is always sort of somehow integrated in the purpose of a given law, et cetera, et cetera. So there are limits to discretion. And I said, fine, but at the last moment, the last moment is authoritarian. And to my great relief, one of my liberal heroes is Ronald Dworkin. He compared it to the donut, and I think I included that in the book. He said that in the center of the donut, he said there is nothing liberal. There's nothing, and so I would just say I would fill it in, and I would say it's authoritarian. I find Mike Wilkinson from England, he is too strong. He talks about authoritarian liberalism, and he doesn't make a distinction between authoritarianism and liberalism. And I think that's too much. And in the spirit of my response to Nathan, I would say we would have to be more differentiated and in the end come out with a, I don't know. Yeah, I would say a phenomenology of various forms of authoritarianisms, whether they could be based on the economic policies, they could be based on administrative agencies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Does it come close to your question?
Yes, thanks.
Günter, we have a few more minutes, and there is a question coming to me from the chat about the temporality question on how constitution evolve over time and how we can. So for one country, we can bring the temporality scales about the evolution of a regime and how is evolving. We make his constitution evolving depending on how long he is in power. So if you could comment on that temporality aspect.
Thank you. A wonderful question. And they really picked me because I skipped that in my presentation. I just mentioned it, but I didn't elaborate. What I wanted to say is temporality has two aspects. Of course, it's connected to tenure, and then it has to be somehow destroyed by the ownership concept of power, which many like Putin has done it, Xi Jinping has done it, but also many presidents in Latin America. But the other and maybe more interesting aspect of temporality is that I found that in a statement by Hitler. He said in one of his first speeches when he was in power, "Give me 4 years." And then I found very similar sentences by other presidents. They said, sort of, relax your rule of law and representation concerns. Give me 4 years and I will do the job, and then you will re-elect me. And this is the idea. It's more than temporality. It says suspend the legal restraints, suspend the political representation system for a while. It can be 4 years, or maybe somebody says 2 years, but I found it in repeated, I couldn't find it before when I presented this talk today. And I just thought that's really interesting that autocrats seem to, and they can be dictators or they can be mild autocrats. They always tell you, give me some time to do the job, and get rid of the law and the and the parliamentary thing.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Thank
Günter.
you.
We still have like 3-4 minutes. Do we have?
Oh, great.
Would we have other questions? Could we just come back, and that's something that maybe, because that's what I'm interested in, also the kind of ideological aspect, and how do we see it emerging or not in the constitution, or maybe not the ideological aspect, but the cultural aspect. Do you see we can sometimes identify elements in the kind of autocratic constitution that would dissociate the way you do an autocratic constitution, for example, in the Middle East, the way you would do it in Latin America? And I'm thinking of that because our next event will be, we will have a half-day workshop on illiberalism in Latin America. And that's really interesting to compare, I mean, or to see how the literature, for example, on Latin America is much more as, looking at autocracy or illiberalism, both from the right and the left, much more than what we have been used to do in Europe. And so I was wondering, following Nathan's question also, or discussion on the Middle East, do you see any sometime kind of cultural elements emerging that we can identify, or they are kind of very much uniformized, depending more on the type of regime, but not based on any kind of big cultural features?
I have to say that sort of I'm a fan of the young Marx, and I find his writings crucial. I mean, I use them in class, etc., etc. But the only thing that I think was he shouldn't have done, or Marxists shouldn't have done, is use the concept of ideology as false consciousness, because it has the presupposition that you have the right one. So reading Terry Eagleton, I think I turned away from, not from Marxism, but from this concept of ideology, and I really found ideology a very fruitful for constitutional comparison and law concept, when you say ideology actually is an aspect of world making. It's an interpretation. And so you can look at constitutions and ask yourself, what does the Constitution offer you? Which interpretive framework does it offer you? And for instance, it's unbelievably interesting to look at the preamble of the Chinese Constitution, or the preamble even of the, well, Myanmar, I don't know, it's long and lengthy, but India is interesting. And I find they give you a narrative, and the narrative is part of how you are supposed to see the world if you're a Chinese person, if you're a person from India. And that I found enormously interesting and I tell my students, I said, in constitutional law, it's very often important to look at the things that people think are irrelevant or marginal. Because to say that in India has a guarantee of freedom of speech, give me a break. Of course, every constitution guarantees freedom of speech, maybe not in Brunei, but everyone. It doesn't tell you anything, but I think I would say these stories that you get that are being told, they tell you what, I hope I understood your question right. They tell you how you should understand the world, how you could interpret it. And in that sense, constitutions can be enormously powerful.
Yeah, they are sense-making. Exactly. Yes.
The Constitution says, I make sense for you. Just read me.
Yeah. So it's back also to the kind of the role of constitution in nationhood, or at least demonstrating nationhood. And yeah. Well, great. Well, I think on that, it will be time for us to conclude. So I wanted to thank you, all of us, for being with us today, and to thank Günter for his great presentation, and congratulations again for the book, Günter. We have it here now at the Institute, and we are happy to share it with our colleagues here, and hopefully we will see you soon in Washington, D.C. For those of us who are in D.C., then we would be delighted to see you. Thank you so much all for joining us today.